He's the fighter who turned defiance into a legacy, Stockton's original rebel, Nick Diaz. Long before viral clips and crossover stars, Nick built a cult following by fighting anyone, anywhere, and doing it his way. But behind the iconic stare-downs, the middle fingers, and the endless cardio lies a fortune that few fans truly understand. From headlining Strikeforce as a welterweight champion to earning massive UFC paydays against legends like St-Pierre and Silva, Nick transformed grit into millions. Yet his empire isn't just fight purses. It's homes in California, cars that roar through Stockton streets, and a cannabis business that turned his name into a lifestyle brand. And hidden behind the smoke is a twist investment that reveals a side of Nick few expected. This is the untold story of Nick Diaz's wealth, from the struggle to the spotlight to the empire built by a man who never sold out but still cashed in. Nick Diaz's story begins far from the mansions of Las Vegas or the spotlight of Madison Square Garden. Born in 1983 in Stockton, California, Nick grew up in an environment where money was scarce and opportunities were limited. Stockton wasn't a glamorous place to come of age. It was a city defined by working-class grit, high crime rates, and a reputation for toughness. For many kids in his neighborhood, the idea of financial stability or fame was little more than a distant dream. But for Nick, the fight to survive and the fight to succeed became one and the same. His earliest years were marked by hardship, but also by an obsession with martial arts. Nick discovered Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu as a teenager, training under Cesar Gracie, who became both a mentor and a lifelong influence. At the time, MMA wasn't yet a global business, and fighters weren't making millions. But Nick's competitive fire and relentless discipline quickly set him apart. He wasn't just training for trophies, he was training for survival, for pride, and eventually for a ticket out of Stockton. By his late teens, Nick had already stepped into the cage as a professional. His early fights were not glamorous. Small promotions, low paydays, and grueling conditions. Some of his first professional bouts paid only a few $100s, just enough to cover expenses and barely scratch the surface of financial security. But what he lacked in income, he made up for with relentless performances that caught the eye of bigger promotions. The UFC came calling early. In 2003, at just 20 years old, Nick Diaz debuted in the octagon. He made an instant impression by finishing Jeremy Jackson with a submission, showing off the jiu-jitsu skills that would become his trademark. The checks were still small compared to what modern fighters earn, but for a kid from Stockton, stepping into the UFC meant more than money. It meant possibility. But as quickly as Nick rose, he also faced setbacks. Losses to established names like Diego Sanchez and Joe Riggs stalled his momentum. And yet, even in defeat, his personality, brash, unfiltered, and authentic, built a cult following. Fans weren't drawn to him because he played the game. They were drawn to him because he refused to. By the mid-2000s, Nick's career had already taken on the shape it would carry for decades. Turbulent, unpredictable, but undeniably captivating. And while the early checks weren't life-changing, the stage was set for bigger paydays, especially when Nick found his way to Strikeforce. Because if Stockton gave Nick his toughness, Strikeforce gave him his first taste of real money. Nick Diaz's breakthrough moment in terms of wealth didn't come in the UFC at first. It came in Strikeforce, a promotion that embraced his fighting style and gave him the spotlight he craved. In 2010, Nick captured the Strikeforce welterweight championship, and suddenly his paychecks reflected his star power. Unlike the early UFC fights where fighters were often underpaid, Strikeforce built events around Nick. His walkouts, his stare-downs, and his relentless pressure in the cage drew fans in droves. As Strikeforce's biggest star, Nick began earning six-figure paydays, a monumental leap from the scraps of his early career. His title defenses, including memorable battles against the likes of Paul Daly, became legendary, not just for the action inside the cage, but for the cult-like following he built outside it. Every event he headlined in Strikeforce didn't just make him richer. It cemented his brand as the Stockton rebel who fought on his own terms. When the UFC eventually absorbed Strikeforce, Nick returned to the octagon a star. His fights were no longer buried on undercards, they were main events, and the paychecks followed. His bout against BJ Penn in 2011 reportedly earned him close to $200,000, a number that swelled with bonuses and sponsorships. But the real money came with St-Pierre at UFC 158. That fight, one of the most hyped welterweight title bouts of its era, brought Nick a payday north of $500,000 guaranteed, with additional pay-per-view bonuses likely pushing his total into the millions. His return fights against Silva and later appearances only added to his wealth. Even in defeat, Nick was box office gold. Fans didn't just tune in to see him win, they tuned in to see him fight, period. And the UFC knew it. Pay-per-view sales soared whenever his name was attached, translating into bigger purses and back-end points. It's estimated that across his UFC career alone, Nick Diaz earned several $1 million in fight purses and bonuses, but those numbers don't capture the full picture. The loyalty of his fan base ensured that every fight came with an economic ripple effect: merchandise sales, ticket demand, and sponsorship exposure. In an era where fighters often struggled to break through to mainstream audiences, Nick was different. He didn't need to be polished or media-friendly. His authenticity was the product, and fans bought into it. But Nick's fortune wasn't built solely inside the cage. Outside the octagon, his ventures, particularly in boxing and side competitions, offered both paydays and financial opportunities that went beyond MMA's limitations. Because while UFC paychecks made him wealthy, boxing opened the door to another world of money. What many fans forget about Nick Diaz's career is that he wasn't limited to MMA. In 2005, he stepped into the professional boxing ring, an unusual move at the time for an MMA fighter. His debut came against Alfonso Rocha, and while the fight itself wasn't a blockbuster, it represented something bigger: Nick's willingness to chase opportunities beyond the UFC. Boxing, even at the entry level, offered larger paydays than many MMA promotions at the time. While his single recorded pro boxing match didn't transform him into a crossover star, it hinted at the economic potential fighters like Nick could tap into if they stepped outside MMA's confines. Years later, as fighters like Conor McGregor and Anderson Silva explored boxing super fights, Nick's decision to test those waters looked like a foreshadowing of the industry's evolution. Beyond boxing, Nick also participated in grappling super fights, seminars, and appearances that carried financial weight. Grappling events, especially those tied to his jiu-jitsu lineage, allowed him to cash in without the physical toll of MMA. These appearances weren't just side income, they were branding opportunities, reinforcing his Stockton image while building financial independence. But perhaps Nick's greatest outside competition was the constant battle for autonomy. Unlike many fighters who bent to promotional pressures, Nick fought on his terms. This stubbornness often cost him opportunities in the short term, but it also solidified his cult status. Fans loved that Nick was unpredictable, that he fought only when he wanted, and that he never conformed. That independence, in turn, gave him economic leverage. Still, these ventures only laid the foundation. The real empire Nick built, the wealth that continues to grow even after years away from the octagon, was constructed not in a cage or a ring, but in the world of business. Because Nick Diaz wasn't just a fighter, he was a brand, and that brand would soon translate into homes, cars, and entire companies tied to his name. For Nick Diaz, wealth has never been about abandoning his roots. While many fighters who strike it rich immediately flock to Los Angeles, Miami, or Las Vegas, Nick has always stayed true to his Stockton identity. His real estate story begins, and largely remains, in the same place that shaped him, California's Central Valley. Nick has been linked to a modest but well-established home in Stockton, a property that reflects both his loyalty to his community and his desire to maintain privacy. The house, while not the sprawling multi-million-dollar estates that some fighters flaunt, still carries the marks of success: spacious living areas, secure surroundings, and plenty of room for family, training, and relaxation. For Nick, it wasn't about moving into a Beverly Hills mansion to prove his worth. It was about creating a space where he could live comfortably without losing the connection to his hometown. But Stockton isn't just sentimental, it's strategic. Real estate in the area is far more affordable than in California's coastal cities, and for an investor, that creates opportunity. Over the years, Nick has reportedly put money into additional local properties, either as rental homes or long-term investments. These properties generate steady income, less flashy than fight night checks, but far more reliable in the long run. For a fighter who's seen both highs and lows in his career, that kind of financial stability is essential. There have also been whispers of Nick exploring properties outside Stockton, possibly in Nevada and Southern California. Training camps, business ventures, and travel often bring fighters into new real estate opportunities, and Nick is no exception. Still, his strongest ties remain with his hometown, and fans often point to his refusal to upgrade to a Hollywood lifestyle as proof of his authenticity. The value of these homes isn't just monetary, they represent something much deeper. To Nick, real estate is security. It's a hedge against the unpredictability of a fight career that has been stopped and restarted restarted more times than most. While he has spent money on cars and luxuries, owning homes ensures that no matter what happens in the cage, Stockton will always be home. And that Stockton loyalty is what makes Nick Diaz's wealth so unique. Most athletes view wealth as a ticket to escape their pasts. Nick sees it as a chance to preserve his. His properties are not just assets on paper. They're anchors to the city that gave him everything. But if his homes represent permanence, the loudest signs of his fortune, the things fans could see on the streets, were found in his driveways. Because for Nick Diaz, cars weren't just transportation, they were statements. Nick Diaz has never been a fighter who parades his wealth in front of cameras, but look closer and you'll see the signs of luxury. While he may not own fleets of exotic hypercars like Conor McGregor, his collection of vehicles reflects both taste and personality, part Stockton grit, part superstar indulgence. Over the years, Nick has been spotted in a range of cars, from American muscle to luxury imports. Vehicles like Chevrolet Camaros and Dodge Chargers have been linked to him, fitting choices for a fighter who embodies raw power and no-nonsense appeal. These cars, while not always the most expensive, scream character, and that's exactly what Nick has always been about. But make no mistake, Nick has also indulged in higher-end rides. Reports have placed him behind the wheel of Mercedes-Benz models, sleek and comfortable, as well as SUVs that fit the practical side of his lifestyle. For someone constantly traveling between Stockton, fight camps, and business ventures, having reliable yet stylish vehicles makes sense. Motorcycles have also played a role in Nick's wealth expression. Much like his fighting style, bikes represent freedom, rebellion, and adrenaline. Riding through Stockton streets, Nick projected the same aura he carried into the cage: fast, fearless, and unbothered by expectations. Recreational vehicles, too, have surfaced in his orbit, giving him both mobility and outlets for his adventurous lifestyle. Yet, what makes Nick's car and bike collection interesting isn't the dollar amount, it's the balance. Unlike some fighters who go broke chasing supercars, Nick's choices reflect someone who enjoys luxury, but doesn't drown in it. His cars tell a story not of reckless spending, but of selective indulgence. He buys what he likes, not just what impresses. And there's another angle to his vehicles. They've become part of his identity with fans. Seeing Nick in Stockton, cruising in a recognizable ride, connects him to his community in ways a Rolls-Royce in Beverly Hills never could. It keeps him accessible, grounded, and authentic, even when the price tags prove he's long surpassed average living. But while cars and bikes were loud symbols of his wealth, they were nothing compared to the empire he built in business, a venture that not only made him rich, but turned him into a cultural icon. Because Nick Diaz didn't just fight for money, he built a brand that became a movement. If there's one business move that defines Nick Diaz's wealth, it's his entry into the cannabis industry. Long before legalization swept across America, Nick and his brother Nate were outspoken advocates for marijuana use in recovery, wellness, and everyday life. What was once seen as controversial, even career-threatening, became their calling card. And when the laws changed, Nick was perfectly positioned to turn advocacy into empire. Together with Nate, Nick co-founded Game Up Nutrition, a wellness and CBD brand that quickly expanded into cannabis-related products. What began as a niche venture has become a full-fledged business empire, offering everything from CBD supplements to apparel and lifestyle goods. The brand isn't just profitable, it's personal. It ties directly into the Diaz brothers' image: authentic, rebellious, and unapologetic. Fans don't just buy the products, they buy into the Stockton ethos behind them. But cannabis isn't the only lane Nick has explored. Over the years, he's launched clothing lines and merchandise, capitalizing on the iconic 209 identity that he and Nate popularized. The numbers aren't just a reference to Stockton's area code, they're a badge of loyalty for fans worldwide. Shirts, hats, and gear bearing the Diaz name sell not because of slick marketing, but because of raw authenticity. Seminars and appearances have also contributed significantly to Nick's income. Fans across the globe have paid top dollar to learn from him in Brazilian jiu-jitsu seminars, hear him speak, or simply be part of the Diaz experience. Unlike some fighters who fade after retirement, Nick has turned his cult following into a consistent stream of revenue that requires no cage fighting. And behind the scenes, Nick has invested in smaller ventures tied to fitness and wellness. Training gyms, personal coaching, and possible supplement partnerships hint at a diversified portfolio. None of these ventures may match the scale of his cannabis empire, but together they create a foundation of financial resilience. The cannabis industry, however, remains the crown jewel. As legalization continues to spread, the Diaz brothers' early adoption of the movement puts them at the forefront of an industry worth worth billions. For Nick, who once faced suspensions and fines for marijuana use, the irony is striking. What once cost him money and opportunity has now become one of his greatest sources of wealth. But even with a cannabis empire, a brand identity, and loyal fans, Nick's financial journey carries one more layer, a twist asset that reveals a completely different side of him. Because beyond the obvious, Nick Diaz invested in something no one expected. For most fighters, endorsements are a simple equation. Corporate sponsors pay big money, and in exchange, the fighter represents their brand. But Nick Diaz has never been most fighters. His career, his personality, and his entire identity clashed with the polished, media-friendly expectations that most corporations wanted. He wasn't smiling for cameras, he wasn't delivering rehearsed lines, and he wasn't playing politics. And yet, that refusal to bend became his brand. During his peak UFC years, Nick did secure sponsorship deals, though never on the scale of fighters like St-Pierre or John Jones. Companies saw his cult following and recognized his drawing power. Reebok, before the UFC's exclusive apparel deal, had ties to him. Supplement brands and smaller apparel companies also partnered with Nick, particularly those who wanted to tap into the counterculture vibe he represented. These deals weren't worth millions in themselves, but combined with fight purses, they added up, and more importantly, they amplified his image. But where Nick truly shined was not in chasing corporate endorsements, but in creating his own. The 209 brand, shared with Nate, became a global phenomenon. Fans from California to Japan proudly wear the numbers, not because of some slick ad campaign, but because those numbers represent authenticity, rebellion, and loyalty. That grassroots branding, selling t-shirts, hoodies, and merchandise, became one of the Diaz brothers' biggest revenue streams. And unlike sponsorships, it didn't depend on fighting. It depended on identity. The Diaz brand is a rare case in combat sports, a brand that is bigger than wins or losses. Even during Nick's long absences from competition, fans kept buying. They bought because the brand wasn't tied to titles. It was tied to culture. Stockton became more than a city. It became a movement. That's something no UFC marketing machine could manufacture. Endorsements also came in forms less visible to the public. Private appearances, training seminars, and underground deals tied to the cannabis industry often went unreported but paid handsomely. For fighters outside the mainstream endorsement world, these quiet deals often provided income that never showed up on official lists but still padded their fortunes. What makes Nick's approach to endorsements so unique is that he turned what seemed like a weakness, his refusal to play corporate games, into a strength. He created a brand more powerful than any outside sponsor could give him. He wasn't selling Gatorade or Nike, he was selling Stockton. He was selling Nick Diaz. And fans never stopped buying. But within that self-built empire lies one of the most fascinating parts of Nick's wealth story, a twist asset that no one expected from Stockton's original rebel. Because beyond cannabis, fights, and fan gear, Nick put his money somewhere surprising and surprisingly smart. For years, the image of Nick Diaz was simple: the fighter, the rebel, the Stockton soldier who refused to play by the rules. But behind the scenes, Nick was making decisions that didn't fit that stereotype. The twist in his wealth story is that Nick Diaz has been linked to fitness and wellness investments, ventures that reflect a level of maturity and foresight rarely credited to him. One of the most notable assets is his involvement with gyms and training facilities. Through the Cesar Gracie lineage and alongside his brother Nate, Nick has invested in spaces that serve both as training hubs and community centers. These gyms aren't just about profit, they're about legacy. They allow Nick to pass down his skills, maintain his brand presence, and create a steady stream of income that lasts long after fight nights. For fans, training at a Diaz-affiliated gym isn't just about learning jiu-jitsu. It's about becoming part of the Stockton story. Another surprising move has been Nick's connection to real estate beyond Stockton, particularly in Nevada. Reports suggest he has ties to land holdings and properties that provide long-term stability. While fighters often pour money into flashy cars and luxury lifestyles, Nick's diversification into property shows a side of him fans rarely see, the side that thinks beyond the next fight. There have also been whispers of Nick dipping into wellness and recovery businesses. CBD, health products, and alternative therapies have been areas of interest, especially since Nick has always lived at the intersection of athletic performance and counterculture. If these ventures prove true, they place him not just as a cannabis entrepreneur, but as a broader player in the booming wellness market. What makes this twist asset compelling is how it clashes with the public's perception of Nick. To many, he's still the fighter giving middle fingers at weigh-ins, or the athlete suspended for cannabis misuse. But the reality is that Nick, quietly and consistently, has put money into things that outlast controversy. Fitness centers, real estate, wellness, these are not the moves of a reckless brawler. They're the moves of a man who, despite everything, has learned to play the long game. This is the Nick Diaz paradox, the rebel who refuses to conform publicly, while privately making financial moves that scream stability. It's a twist asset because it's unexpected, but also because it's a twist in his narrative, a reminder that even Stockton's wildest son knows how to secure the bag. And that brings us to the bigger picture, not just what Nick Diaz owns, but what it all means for his legacy. Because Nick's wealth is more than dollars and assets. It's a reflection of his fight, his family, and his place in MMA history. Nick Diaz's wealth story cannot be measured the same way as Conor McGregor's whiskey empire, John Jones's UFC paydays, or Khabib's promotional ventures. Nick's fortune isn't just about numbers on paper. It's about survival, independence, and loyalty. It's the story of a man who stayed true to himself, built a cult following, and still managed to cash in without ever selling out. Financially, his career has been a mix of highs and lows. Fight purses across Strikeforce and the UFC earned him millions. The GSP and Silva bouts alone put him in the millionaire bracket. Add to that his cannabis empire, merchandise, seminars, and investments in gyms and real estate, and Nick's net worth is estimated in the several million-dollar range. Not McGregor-level wealth, but far beyond what most fighters of his generation achieved. But the true value of Nick Diaz's wealth lies in how he earned it. He didn't play the corporate game. He didn't chase endorsements that clashed with his personality. He didn't fake smiles for sponsors. Instead, he built his brand around being real, and his fans rewarded him for it. Every t-shirt sold, every seminar booked, every cannabis product purchased is proof that authenticity can be more profitable than compliance. His legacy is also tied to the Diaz family empire. While Nate may have surpassed him in pure earnings thanks to the Conor McGregor fights, it was Nick who built the foundation. Without Nick, there is no 209 movement. Without Nick, Nate doesn't become the global superstar he is today. In that sense, Nick's wealth extends beyond his own assets. It's embedded in the family brand, the Stockton mythos, and the generations of fighters and fans who carry the 209 identity. Compared to other fighters, Nick's financial legacy may look smaller on paper, but it carries something money can't buy: loyalty. His fans don't just respect him for his fighting, they respect him for never compromising who he is. That kind of wealth, cultural wealth, brand wealth, legacy wealth, is what ensures Nick Diaz will remain relevant, even decades after his final fight. So, when we look at Nick Diaz's fortune, the homes, the cars, the cannabis empire, the twist asset, we see more than a net worth. We see a reflection of his career itself, defiant, authentic, and unforgettable. Because for Nick Diaz, wealth was never about leaving Stockton. It was about bringing Stockton with him every step of the way.